Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. For those of you who have just arrived, we're actually through half of our program, and we begin the afternoon session with a keynote speech by Professor Zbigniew Brzezinski, who in this crowd doesn't need much of an introduction, but I feel compelled to make a few remarks in any case, because for many, many years, Professor Brzezinski taught in this building and had his office just 2 floors below us. So he is a storehouse of memories, so to speak, when it comes to events and people who have come through Columbia University and had something to do with world politics. As I understand it today, our distinguished guest is going to be speaking not so much about Poland, but the context in which Polish foreign policy is made. And that's something that we are reminded of almost on a daily basis when we pick up the paper or turn on our computers and find out what this government or that government is doing in the world, and then begin to wonder, how is the new Polish government going to react to this? As most of you know, the government of Poland was just voted in a week or so ago, and so its foreign policy options are sort of on the table. That's another reason why listening to a specialist like Dr. Brzezinski is important, because it sets the tone for understanding what may or may not happen in Warsaw. I don't want to give his speech for him, because of course I can't, and I don't want to take up any of his time and your time. I will say that it will probably be a speech on the shorter side, and Dr. Brzezinski will be happy to take questions from the audience. So let me please ask our guest to speak.
Professor Mickiel, ladies and gentlemen, first of all, let me say how nice it is to be back here in this building at Columbia. I haven't been in this building for 20 years. In fact, I haven't been at Columbia University for 20 years, so it's quite a homecoming for me. And Columbia was a major milestone in my academic career, but in some respects, more importantly, at least to me, it was also the springboard for my non-academic, or perhaps one can even call it political career. So I have many associations with Columbia that I treasure. I'm also delighted to be participating in this conference, which addresses an important and timely issue, because Poland is not only again independent, but because it is independent, it has to have a foreign policy. Poland is a player on the European scene, and through Europe and through the ocean, Poland can contribute in some measure to the kind of world we live in. So it is timely to reflect historically on Poland's foreign policy, but also to think, as I would like to do out loud, about the implications for Poland of its own changing geopolitical context. And in reference to that broad subject, I propose to address essentially 3 broad issues. The first involves the proposition that historically, for Poland, its current geopolitical context, and I have said this before, and I'm sure it's not a revelation to anyone, but it is worth repeating, Poland enjoys the best geopolitical context in its entire history. It is the best ever. It has never been as good as it is today, if one considers Poland's history, Poland's geography, and Poland's experience. To the west of Poland, there is something that's being called Europe. And it is not only a geographical designation, nor is it only a cultural designation. It has significant political overtones, even if not carried to the ultimate logical conclusion. There is a Europe, politically, in the process of being shaped. And there's certainly an economic union, financial union, that is an ongoing reality. That has never existed in the same fashion before, and particularly with the kind of self-definition that Europe has. There was the Holy Roman Empire once to the west of Poland, but the Holy Roman Empire wasn't very holy and wasn't very Roman. But it was an empire and had some of the imperial attributes that empires have. So that wasn't such a felicitous experience. In that respect, what there is today to the west of Poland is truly new and is truly good. That is to say, a Europe committed to the notion of transnational cooperation, committed to the idea of a European role in the world that involves the propagation as well as institutionalization of certain basic values, a Europe which doesn't harbor imperial aspirations, a Europe which, if anything, is perhaps too pacifist rather than anything else. And in that context, it is also important to recognize that to the west of Poland, a process of truly significant and historically almost unprecedented Polish-German reconciliation has been underway now for a number of years. It has had its ups, it has had its downs, but the basic trend is certainly one of reconciliation. It has many symbolic expressions, but has also many tangible realities. And the commingling of the two nations is taking place. In that respect, the situation to the west is really extremely favorable to Poland, to an unprecedented historical degree. Moreover, within that Europe, Poland entertains legitimate aspirations to be one of the more important players. In the community or union of 25, Poland certainly legitimately can claim to be one of the top 6. And while that is not a formalized reality, it is nonetheless a latent reality which, by virtue of being a reality, even if latent, has political significance. So the situation geopolitically in that respect is favorable. But let us look at the East. When did Poland have a better situation in the East than it has today? Russian borders are roughly the same as those of Ivan the Terrible. Russia has moved back several hundred years. There is a sort of buffer state between Poland and Russia, a buffer state as vulnerable, whose future is uncertain, but it is there nonetheless, Belarus. And it is an open issue whether it will continue or not. But even if it doesn't continue, it is fair to assume that the notion of nationalism has also begun to affect the attitudes of younger Belarusians. And the process of redigesting Belarus by Russia, should it occur, is not going to be all that simple. So in that respect, Poland's situation is more favorable. But even more important, of course, is the fact that there is an independent Ukraine. President Kwasniewski, in a sentence which I'm sure he deeply regrets saying, but which was quite accurate, said that, of course, he likes Russia, but he likes a Russia without Ukraine even better. And I think in that respect, he voiced the sentiment of many Poles, of most Poles. And of course, it's not an accident that this innocent-sounding sentence so strongly offended his neighbor to the east. But a neighbor to the east who's far more distant, far weaker, far more uncertain of its own future. It is a neighbor that for the first time in its history is truly a national state. But a national state with serious demographic problems. When Russia became a separate federation, it had 151 million people. Today it has 144. The demographic drop is serious. It's far-reaching. There are some indications that it may be accelerating. Of the 143 million or so citizens of the Russian Federation, only 116 million are Russians. Of the remaining 30 or so million, 20 million are Muslims at a time of intensifying Muslim political identity. So Russia has serious problems. Russia has serious internal problems which do place a question mark regarding its future role and certainly very much change its ability to affect Polish history the way Russia did affect Polish history over the last several hundred years, affected it in a very decisive fashion, which for Poland also meant the progressive loss of independence. And then, still looking at this favorable geopolitical situation, across the ocean, the United States, to which Poland is actually allied. And that United States today is the only superpower in the world. That relationship between Poland and America gives Polish foreign policy a transatlantic dimension, which it never really had before. To be sure, an American president once said that Poland is the conscience of the world. But it was one of those nice sayings that occasionally are said to Polish visitors, but without much strategic substance. Today there is some strategic substance, let us not exaggerate it, but there is some strategic substance to the relationship between the United States and Poland. And that too gives Poland a wider sense of its place in the world and a more favorable geopolitical setting. Indeed, the combination of an EU to the West and of the US across the ocean means that Poland is associated in an unprecedented fashion with the dominant force in the world, the dominant potential force for good, and is an integral part of the zone of peace. So that is the political context, and it is remarkably favorable. But, and this is the second part of my presentation, watch out. But watch out. For if we look more closely at the West, we also see something else. Some loss of momentum in the process of European unification, some potential, significant indeed, slowing down in the process of the expansion of Europe. Europe confronts some very serious uncertainties. The process of unification, which has so transformed the political culture and the political mission, the political identity of Europe, is slowing down. It is not being reversed yet, and one shouldn't hasten to overly pessimistic conclusions. But some uncertainties do appear on the scene. That unity, which the name symbolizes, European Union, is no longer so strong. Indeed, one of the paradoxes of the present situation is that the European Union, named European Union, followed the European Community, whereas in fact it should have been the other way around. The European Union existed much more prior to 1991. And today the European Union is much more European Community. Because prior to 1991, there was a real basis for political union in a divided Europe. In a divided Europe, it was easier to speak of political union involving France and some other Western European countries and half of Germany. Half of Germany, not all of Germany. Much easier to think of a union in that context, and of Britain more comfortably associated with it, because such a Europe would not necessarily detach itself from the ally across the Atlantic, and such a Europe could comfortably be controlled symbolically more than in reality by the Franco-German leadership, and in practice much more by a more subtle British, French, German interrelationship. But that European Union now is a European community of 25, in which national interests are surfacing, in which the sense of momentum towards intensified political unification has slowed down, in which there are temptations as well as opportunities for asserting the national interest over the common interest. And of course, one sees that from the standpoint of Poland, most dramatically, in the German-Russian relationship. It is, of course, not a relationship directed against Poland, as some, in an exaggerated fashion, proclaim. But it is a relationship based on a more explicit affirmation of respective German and Russian interests, to a degree that was not the case 15 years ago, when in reality the European Union preceded the European community. At that time, there was much more of an inclination to think geopolitically of transcendental, continental interests symbolized by the European Union of Western Europe. Today, national interests can surface. And they can surface with greater intensity and sometimes with some adverse consequences for the national interests of others. And the Poles are naturally concerned about the implications of some aspects of German-Russian relations that have manifested themselves in the course of the last several years. And that, in turn, is associated with some degree of resurgence of genuine nationalist priorities. Nationalist, not in the pejorative meaning of the word, but simply descriptively, national interest, nationalistically defined. And that is becoming a more pervasive phenomenon. And in that context, of course, the national interests of Poland may not rank the highest, because Poland is not the leading, or one of the top leading European states. There are others who are more influential, who are richer, and who may have interests that they can pursue more effectively bilaterally, even at some indirect costs to their neighbors. The situation in the West is further complicated by the clearly increased distance across the Atlantic. The Atlantic has become wider. It has become deeper. It is no longer so easily spanned. There's no doubt that the last several years have seen a significant deterioration in the mutual American-European perceptions and attitudes. The way the United States defines its global interests increasingly diverges from the way most Europeans define Europe's global interests. This is a question of strategy, in part. This is a question of methods, in part. This is a question of values, in part. And all of that differs significantly from what existed, let us say, 10 years ago. And that has consequences, because it means that there is no automaticity or identity of European and American perspectives on the world insofar as Poland is concerned. It creates a situation in which sometimes choices, and sometimes very painful choices, have to be made. So in that sense, the situation to the West is now more complex, less so clear-cut. There are some dangers. It doesn't alter the basic diagnosis. The context is good and better than ever. But there are now some warning signals insofar as the West is concerned. And if the United States, for example, gets more deeply involved in a conflict with Islam, the chances are that the fissures in the American-European relationship will grow wider. If the United States embarks on a political self-definition in which Islamophobic language becomes increasingly the official language of the United States, including of its president, the chances are that more and more Europeans will take their distance. And that will begin even more deeply to affect the homogeneity of the West, its strategic shared sense of purpose, and complicate the situation for Poland. And that aspect is further complicated by some developments in Poland. One senses, as one looks at Poland from afar, but with some degree of historical and personal identification, an inclination towards intensifying parochialism. I would certainly not call it nationalism or chauvinism, but it is a kind of assertive parochialism that increasingly dominates the Polish political discourse, the Polish view of the world, a sense of self-righteousness, a tendency towards some extreme language in dealing with one's neighbors, an inclination to assume the worst about the motives of others, even if what the others do may not be all that favorable, but not necessarily quite as evil as described. To call a pipeline the equivalent of the Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact is, to me, somewhat of an overstatement, to put it mildly. And that affects also Poland's place in Europe and the way Poland is perceived in Europe. Some of the same is manifesting itself even in Polish attitude towards its eastern neighbors. President Kwaśniewski's language was delicate, even though offensive to the excessively sensitive Russians. But some of the language used by others is less delicate. And it has had the effect, maybe unfairly, maybe altogether unfairly, but not undamagingly for Poland to be viewed increasingly as motivated by Russophobia. And that diminishes the significance of the Polish voice in Europe. Poland has a natural role to play as the lead voice in the articulation of the European, quote-unquote, Union's policy towards the East. But the ability to do that, and for that voice to be respected, is diminished if it is assumed that it is driven by Russophobic instincts. To be sure, again, many in the Kremlin are deliberately propagating that message and are interpreting any criticism of Russia, even the most justified, as an expression of Russophobia. But it is part of political wisdom to be aware of how others might use one's own language and one's own posture, and to operate in a way that anticipates and deflects that. And I'm not sure that everything that has recently transpired in Poland has been sufficiently responsive to that geopolitical imperative. But most important to me is somehow or other the sense in Europe that Poland is sliding into an attitude of a domestic parochialism so deeply rooted in its national and Catholic traditions that it begins to create a gap between Poland and Europe. That too may be an unfair judgment, but it is important that Poles be aware of it, because there is such a thing as a pathology of words, and words do have effect, and one has to be sensitive to it. And that is related to a third aspect, which makes me inclined to say that one has to be alert and vigilant regarding the favorable geopolitical context, and that is actual developments in the East. I've already alluded to the fact that Belarus may be swallowed up. It may not be easily digested, as in the past, but that's not really a great consolation. The digestion may be more difficult, but the fact of the digestion will still have geostrategic consequences. For it will mean that Russia's borders are no longer those of Ivan the Terrible. It will mean these will be the borders of Russia, roughly those of 1941, at least in the northeastern areas of Poland. Ukraine will still be independent. And that could even lead to a more serious risk, which it is difficult to discuss without being misunderstood, and which nonetheless calls for being noted. Namely, that while Europe today is a zone of peace, it is a partial zone of peace. There are parts of Europe in which there has been violence. There are parts of Europe in which there is violence. There are parts of Europe in which there could be violence. Some parts of Europe in which there has been violence are actually west of Poland. Slovenia, Croatia. Some parts of Europe in which there is violence are east of Poland, particularly in the Caucasus, to a lesser extent in Moldova. There could be violence directly east of Poland, in Belarus, especially if the process of digestion was not smooth, if national issues complicated it. And that could all of a sudden put on the agenda something which many of us have assumed is now past history. The question of security, the question of even military vulnerability. Imagine a situation in which the process of Belarus's absorption or digestion is not peaceful, not only difficult, but actually produces some conflicts. Suppose on the Polish-Belarusian frontier there are major instabilities, conflicts. They erupt very suddenly. Look at France. Suppose the border is breached by thousands, then tens of thousands of refugees. Suppose some form of violence erupts. Suppose the Belarusian army is engaged, or an army ostensibly in Belarusian uniforms, but not really Russian, but not really Belarusian. It's awfully close to the capital of Poland. It's very close to that frontier. It's incidentally a largely undefended capital with very small garrison, with a large airfield. One can envisage a scenario in which all of a sudden there's conflict. And of course one will say, well, but Poland is a member of NATO. Yes. But suppose that conflict is politically ambiguous. Suppose that conflict doesn't clearly define who's the aggressor and who's the defender. Suppose that conflict creates a situation in which there is a cross-current of accusations as to who started it and who's pursuing it. And suppose in the process, nonetheless, the conflict escalates, but remains politically ambiguous. I raised that issue once with a group of Polish military strategists, and their first reaction reminded me absolutely of 1939. Poland is a member of NATO. Just as in 1939, Polish military said, we have an alliance with France and Great Britain, and they're obligated to start military hostilities offensively against Nazi Germany 2 weeks after the attack on Poland. It took much longer than that, 5 years. Suppose the conflict is politically ambiguous. What happens then? In a situation in which Poland's strategic planning and defense strategy is very much dependent on integration into an alliance system, but the conflict is ambiguous. What then are the strategic implications of everything that I have said, which is my concluding part? With respect to the last, since that is the freshest in your minds, let me simply suggest that in addition to complete, loyal, and devoted integration into NATO alliance, Poland should have a modest, I repeat, a modest, nationally autonomous defense capability, capable of sustaining itself for a sufficiently long period of time so that an ambiguous war begins to be defined in the political mind of the West as a war of aggression, justifying, indeed compelling, a collective NATO response. How long should that capability last? It's very hard to judge, but I would say something in the range of 2 to 3 weeks minimum. But 2 to 3 weeks of a capability to defend particularly the political centers of authority and military command and control, preferably including the capital. That Poland today does not have. It literally does not have that. Because in years past, its entire military integration was, of course, oriented towards a war directed at the West. In recent years, it has been reintegrated into a larger NATO structure, but without any thought given to a really serious, independent, autonomous capability for a solitary military undertaking. That Poland should have, because it will take a few weeks before Western public opinion begins to understand what is at stake. I was once having lunch with President Havel. My wife was with me. It was the two of us. She's of Czech origin. We were in the Hradčany Palace. And during the lunch, Havel said to me, "Tell me, Dr. Brzezinski, if the Russians attack us, will you in America come and defend us?" This is an authentic story. And I said to him, "Excuse me, Mr. President, but if you don't mind, that really is the wrong question. The real question is, if the Russians attack you, will you defend yourselves?" I'm going to scrap that text completely. I would like you to come in with me, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to put the tape recorder in front of you, and I'm going to ask you the very same question I asked you right now. And please answer it exactly the same way. And then I'll make my speech. And we did that. And of course, his speech took off on what I said. And he said, we should have done that in 1938. And who knows what history might have been. We should have done this in 1948, when the Czech Communist Party was trying to seize power. And who knows what might have been history. We should have done this in 1968. So my first point about the strategic implications is, yes, good geopolitical context, best ever, but some autonomous capability for dealing with unpredictable circumstances which may not be clear-cut is an essential element of prudent planning in a favorable geopolitical setting. My second point regarding strategic implications is that given what I have said about what is happening in Europe, but also what is happening in Poland itself, renewed emphasis has to be put on a priority basis, on a revitalization of German-Polish reconciliation. That is absolutely the sine qua non of Poland's favorable geopolitical context. This has to be emphasized. This has to be pursued. I would like to see the president-elect, Lech Kaczynski, propose immediately a personal meeting, one-on-one, with Angela Merkel, the German chancellor. And there is an obvious setting for it. The German-Polish University in Frankfurt am Oder, right across from the Polish city of Słubice. Only 60 kilometers from Berlin, a little further from Warsaw, but the president-elect can travel a little extra. It's worth it. I think revitalization of the German-Polish relationship is absolutely critical and far more important than Polish-French friendship or Polish-British relations. This is in the immediate interest of Poland, because that will immediately relate Poland again to the larger European adventure, which, while perhaps stumbling and hiccuping, still remains the number one game in Europe. Namely, will there be a Europe? And if there is to be a Europe, Germany is the engine. Germany is the key player. And German-Polish reconciliation is of central importance also in changing Poland's image from an increasingly parochial, inward-oriented, excessively Catholic and nationalist country that may be not even truly European as a result. In that context, we we should also expect and hope that the Poles will make the enlargement of NATO to Ukraine not a primarily Polish project or a Polish-Lithuanian project, noble as it is, but particularly a Polish, German, and British project, because the British actually favor a larger Europe for other reasons unrelated to the issue of Poland. But it so happens that that fits into what I consider to be an intelligent Polish strategy, namely that the inclusion of Ukraine should be something that's pursued actively, not just by Poland or even Poland in the forefront, but Germany and Britain and Poland. And then last but not least, Poland should strive to promote a European foreign policy that speaks to some degree authentically for Europe and not for individual European states. And to the extent that Poland is one of the 6 more important European nations, I think Poland is in a position to encourage the emergence of a European voice that views America as a partner, not as an opponent, but also as a partner that has to listen seriously to what Europe has to say. Because one of the reasons for the current divergence between Europe and America is that America has had little reason to listen to Europe because there was no Europe talking to America. There was a British Prime Minister who was eager to be America's primary, first and only partner, who occasionally whispered good advice, but publicly endorsed anything we did, with the consequence that we pocketed his whispering and took advantage of his public support, but ignored basically what he was advising. A Europe that speaks with 6 common voices united into one, not easy to achieve, it'll take time to cultivate, would be a Europe that America would have to listen to more seriously, and that would have the effect of restoring the American-European partnership. Because only by acting together can America and Europe deal with the problems of the world. Only by acting together are we likely to avoid stumbling into individual difficulties, which for us here in America may mean an increasing, intensifying war with the world of Islam as a whole, and for Europe, a revival of European nationalist aspirations, inimical to the prospects of a united Europe. So in brief, and in final conclusion, the challenge that Poland faces is to take advantage of its very favorable political context, but to take advantage of it in a deliberate, strategically minded fashion that reinvigorates that favorable geopolitical context. Thank you.
We have time for a few questions. Professor Sisson.
You pose Belarus as the potential zone of instability. Are you really convinced that Ukraine is stable enough and well enough anchored into the community of states and not likely again to be the subject of Russian intervention to the degree that Ukraine could not also be a zone of instability for Poland?
My sense is that in spite of all the ambiguities and uncertainties in Ukraine, including the linguistic differences, which I think are exaggerated actually, there is now, in a predominant sense, a Ukrainian political identity. And I have been struck, for example, when I traveled Dnipropetrovsk, Donetsk, and in those regions, where everybody, after greeting me officially in Ukrainian, would speak Russian. That in the end, the basic message was that after a decade and a half of independence, we prefer to have the opportunity to steal on our own via Kiev and not have to do it via Moscow, and to share it with people from Moscow. that if there is corruption, it's our corruption. And we prefer that there is now a statehood with which we identify ourselves for better or for worse. And of course, November of last year also showed that there is momentum for better, particularly in the younger generation. I think the younger generation takes the Ukrainian political reality for granted. This is not to say that the political parties are stabilized. They're not. They're fluid. They're personal. This is not to say that the political system is not corrupt. It's pervasively corrupt as part of the Soviet ethic, but not unique in that respect. But there is a basic sense that the statehood is a reality that is subjectively valued. And I don't think the Russians can reverse that. Also, an additional reason why I don't think the Russians can reverse that is that Russia, in an ambiguous and ambivalent fashion, is becoming more nationalistic in a genuinely Russian sense. Ruski, not Rosyanin, but Ruski. And you see this in the political discourse, in the political literature, in the manifestations. And if that continues, as I think it will, because that is the new source of integration within Russia, that makes it more difficult to swallow other countries. It's easier to swallow other countries if you have some transnational doctrine with which you can mask your imperial ambitions, whether it's the Third Rome or the center of world communism. It's much easier to do that in terms of a supranational identity. It's hard to oppress people on the basis of nationalism. The Poles learned that themselves in oppressing the Ukrainians in interwar Poland, because they didn't have a transnational ideology anymore of the Rzeczpospolita of three nations. It was a national Poland that was trying to Polonize the Ukrainians. And that's why it didn't work. I don't think the Russians can regain Ukraine anymore. Belarus is more ambiguous because I think a much larger degree of the population still does not have a genuine sense of identification with a separate state. But the younger people do increasingly. And then there are serious national problems in Belarus, including a large Polish minority, which could produce this ambiguous scenario on the border that at some point could be a source of difficulty.
Mr. Szczurowski.
Rafał Szczurowski, Nowy Dziennik. Professor Brzeziński, what do you think is one of the biggest challenge facing our Polish diplomacy in the world today, once we overcome problems of joining the European Union and NATO?
Well, I don't think one can talk of a single one challenge. Any country of almost 40 people has a number of challenges, but I spoke about the ones that are going to be preoccupying Poland for some time to come, and I don't think they're going to be overcome that quickly, thereby permitting one to start speculating of challenges beyond the ones I've mentioned, because the ones that I've mentioned are going to be engaging Poland for quite a while yet.
Linda Rosen.
Your very strong recommendation that Poland and other new members of the EU in Central Europe acquire an autonomous defense strategy and military capability. How do you see this squaring with the professed goal on the part of the EU to have a common European security and defense policy?
Well, first of all, I was not advocating it for other Central European states, as you said. I was advocating it specifically for Poland, because Poland specifically may have that problem, and also Poland has the potential capability of being able to respond to that problem on its own, because it is a country of 40 million people, which doesn't need to be totally a protectorate, especially if it's not in its interest to be a protectorate. And I don't think it is, because protectorates necessarily are less sovereign than is desirable. And in this area, I think sovereignty does dictate a capability to pursue one's own national security policy in a manner that defends one's interests. which could be placed in jeopardy, as I said repeatedly, in a problematically, politically ambiguous situation. And that means a limited capability, not a defense policy totally preoccupied with that issue, but a limited capability which ensures certain minima for political reasons. Now, how is that compatible with Europeans' defense policy? Theoretically, it isn't, but practically it is because there is no European defense policy.
Charles Czapkowski.
Professor Brzezinski, about 15 years ago, I heard you speak in Yale to a Polish Institute meeting, and you said Poland was in its best geopolitical position in about 300 years. Today, you've expanded that to Poland's entire history, and I've been speculating what makes the change. I assume membership in NATO is one thing, membership in the European Union is another. Are there any other things that extended from 300 years to 1,000?
Well, I think that, what's really is important is Europe. Europe is changing. And that is a very important process underway. Whether it's 300 years or 600 years doesn't really make much difference. It's the best ever historically, basically. It certainly wasn't better plus 300 years ago. So that's the point.
Identify yourself.
Yes, I'm Jack Wiskowski. I have a question at the end of your speech. You identified Poland should pursue European
Can you speak up a little bit? What?
Poland should pursue European policy. And my question to that is, what is really European policy? As we don't have a European policy of foreign affairs as such, nor there is a point in science seen that such a big will evolve. Well, we see Europe as a target on economic union. However, politically, it's really a conglomerate of states, which interests can be parallel or, as a matter of fact, diverse. So when you said Poland, European policy, what do you mean by that?
Well, I try to illustrate that in two ways. One, first of all, in the narrower sense, by pursuing German-Polish reconciliation, because without that, there's going to be no Poland in Europe. There may be Europe, but Poland's not going to be in it. So that is absolutely sine qua non. But through that, some progressive movement towards the articulation of a European perspective on some of the large issues of the world today, including those that affect America and the American-European relationship. There hasn't been a serious strategic discussion across the Atlantic involving the large issues today that confront America and Europe for a number of years. There have been dialogues separately, individually, with the British, a mini dialogue with Kwasniewski, which perhaps the Poles think is of the same importance as the American-British dialogue, but sadly it is not. And the fact is that there's been a breakdown, essentially, in any strategic discourse between America and France, and under Schroeder, America and Germany. Poland, as one of the 6 countries with a kind of wider interest than its own immediate frontiers, I think could be engaged in the process of trying to stimulate that European dialogue. But I begin again to repeat what I said, particularly through German-Polish reconciliation. And we can't do that if we have a Poland that takes stands defined through such wonderful slogans, which are testimonial to Polish political wisdom, as Nice or death, which gave everybody in Europe a very short lesson in Polish strategic wisdom, not to Poland's benefit. So there are some sort of very obvious lessons to be learned from even very recent experience. And if there is no American-European dialogue, I think the chances are that America and Europe may increasingly go in different directions. America to its own discomfort, in my judgment, but also probably at the cost of reviving intra-European priority on national interests. And Poland is not so strong as to be able to benefit from that. Quite the contrary.
In a sense, I think that's Russia's policy towards Europe. Right?
What?
The way I see it is Russia's policy towards Europe that do not deal with that as Iran.
Yeah, but Poland's not Russia. I think I'm talking about Poland's interests. Russia, of course, has different interests. Yeah.
Okay, we have last two questions, here and here. You first. You first.
Dr. Brzezinski, my name is Mark Yushchuk, and I know from anecdotally that many engineers and mathematicians from Poland worked in Iraq in the 70s. Do you see any role in Poland somehow mediating what happens in Iraq due to its historical legacy there?
Mediating?
In other words, taking a different or role than what the U.S. is doing currently there?
Well, it is true that Polish engineers and others worked in Iraq, but that does not create the basis, for any significant mediation as such. That was the exploitation of a particular economic interest, which was beneficial to Poland, I suppose was beneficial to Iraq also, but it didn't endow Poland with any unique understanding of Iraqi circumstances or with any unique ability to influence events in Iraq. I think Poland, given the divisions between Europe and America, had to make a choice. And while I am a critic of U.S. policy towards Iraq, and some of you may know that I am a fairly outspoken critic of U.S. policy towards Iraq. If I had been in charge of Poland's foreign policy, I would have supported the United States because of reasons of overall assessment of Poland's interests in a divided Europe. Because in a divided Europe, then clearly identifying Poland with the United States ultimately is in Poland's interest. But the real opportunity for mediation, I think, can only come if there is a serious Europe that forges a European perspective on the basis primarily of a dialogue among those European countries that have some foreign policy interests beyond their immediate concerns. And basically there are 6. They happen to be the largest European countries. Britain, with a kind of a global perspective, closely united in its own interests with America, but global nonetheless, but European at the same time. France, still with a kind of sense of its own grandeur and mission, sometimes exaggerated, but nonetheless with some historical validity. Germany, because of its obvious capacity, ability, power militarily as well as economically. Italy, particularly in terms of the Mediterranean. Spain, in terms of North Africa. Poland, in terms of the East, but through Europe, and not in terms of traditional Polish animosities. If those 6 countries could gradually begin to forge what might be viewed as a European global perspective, or even a European regional perspective, then I think the United States would have to listen, and they could mediate in some sense. They could mediate in the sense of perhaps diluting this, in my view, increasingly black and white, almost Manichaean American vision of what is happening in the Middle East, in which it's good guys versus bad guys, forces of freedom versus forces of hatred, or other slogans which in this fashion define what is a very complex reality, but a reality which mishandled has in it the potential of producing very damaging and very consequentially negative consequences for America's position in the world, which derivatively will adversely affect Europe. And if Europe is adversely affected, so will be Poland.
My name is John Trump. What internal political forces in Poland might inhibit Poland's new Minister of Defense, Radek Sikorski, from acting to create an autonomous defense force to defend Poland in case of incursion coming from Belarus?
Well, first of all, something like that cannot be created by one individual, no matter how energetic or able. I've discussed these issues with him, incidentally. But it takes more than the defense minister. It takes the government. It takes the budget. It takes a serious military effort. It takes also a mindset. Because mindsets ultimately are the defining framework for decisions. And you work yourself into a mindset in which your national security in its totality is subordinated to the notion of integration into an alliance system, which is viewed as the source of foolproof security, then it's hard to begin to think of options and ways of responding outside of that mindset. So even that is needed. But I think there are people in Poland who are not unaware of what I was saying. In fact, a couple of years ago, I got an honorary degree from the Polish National Defense Academy, and I raised that issue. And what was striking to me was the very diverse reaction I got from people. Some senior officers were absolutely shocked and stunned and, kind of saying this is absolutely, well, out of their mindset, so to speak. And the alliance guarantees everything. Some younger officers who have been giving some thought, for example, to the use of territorial defense forces for a transitional role, had a different view. So there are people who know that security involves many dimensions and many levels, and one has to be able to operate on several at the same time, even if the primary emphasis correctly is on alliance integration and alliance interoperability and alliance interdependence. Those are overall strategically sound principles, but they should not be exclusionary. They should not override some very specific, hopefully historically transitional aspects of Poland's security situation, which should be anticipated and planned for as well.
Professor Brzezinski, thank you very much. We had to wait 20 years for this return visit. Let's hope that your next visit won't be 20 years from now.
15. Thank you very much. Thank you. I have to run. Thank you very much.